Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Nice to see so many. We shall get, we think, at least one more session in before the surgeons get it, Judy. So we would expect to have another due in a fortnight. Seeing we've finished Queen Victoria, Lord knows what Judy's going to talk about, but she might tell us before she finishes this morning. I hope you found the notes interesting, and we'll now make a start.
Yeah.
Off you go.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Again, thank you for your loyalty. And thank you, Jonathan, for standing in, as you always do. Yes, I promised I would finish Queen Victoria off today. But before we do that, I'm just going to talk about her relationship with her adult children. I think we already know that she wasn't very good with children at all. And she owned up to this. She was totally honest about her not lack of interest in her children. She was far too interested in them, but they had to conform. She didn't really understand children. She didn't enter into their world at all. They had to do as they were told, but they also had to be as much as possible like her husband. He was the absolute role model. So if they weren't like her husband, there was trouble. So I've gone through them individually, and remember she had 9 children. So the firstborn, Vicky. Vicky married young, but Vicky, I think we've already said, was her father's pride and joy. She was very like Prince Albert. She had a very receptive mind. She was very, very academic, intellectual, I could say intellectual, loved books, loved reading, loved learning. She liked all the things he liked, and he had a great affection for her. He wasn't an openly affectionate man, but he very obviously doted on his daughter because she was able to talk to him. He was like a companion for him as she got older. She married young. It was a love match. She married the heir to the Prussian throne, Prince Frederick. And went to live in Berlin. Her mother then started a correspondence which has since become famous, and the book has been published, called Dearest Child. All these letters that she wrote to her daughter over the years. Very, very important from the historical point of view, as very important information. The Queen very open with her daughter in a way that was really rather inappropriate, because her daughter being so much younger, but talking about everything, talking about the Queen's attitude to childbirth and breastfeeding and so on and so forth. Thousands of letters. When her daughter was pregnant with her first child, Queen Victoria wrote up to 5 letters a day. A bit like a sort of very persistent person today, emailing over and over again. These were letters that had to be taken to Berlin. And she confided in Vicky about particularly her concerns with the other children. She treated Vicky almost as though she was a sister rather than a daughter. So we know what the Queen felt about Bertie, about the Prince of Wales, because she talked very, very openly to his sister about what a disappointment he was, how backward he was, etc., etc. She didn't always approve of her daughter. She was very critical, and ironically blaming her daughter, who was small, like Queen Victoria herself, the only one of the children who was very small, blaming her for eating the wrong kind of food and putting weight on.
Popcorn and kettle black.
Yes, exactly, popcorn and kettle black, which the Queen did all the time. She didn't seem to be able to understand what other people might be thinking. She wasn't very good at empathy at all. And this occurred a lot. She would say something critically about a situation. She would criticize it or be very judgmental. And whatever she was saying actually applied to her. So that was Vicky. And as time went by, the Queen confided in her daughter more and more, sort of depended on her really. So moving on to Bertie, well, we know already that she had the Queen had a bad relationship with her son, constant criticism and negativity, partly because the Prince Consort, Prince Albert, had criticised his son. There's a tremendous weight of expectation for the poor boy because he was going to be the future king, and he was expected to be far more grown up than he was capable of being. He was in fact quite immature, might say a slow learner, and it's thought now very likely that he had dyspraxia, because in later life somebody said watching him trim a cigar was an absolute heart in mouth situation, because he'd got this big knife and he was trying to chop the end of his cigar and sort of about to chop the ends off his fingers. He was very, very clumsy and a very bad shot. People were quite worried about him when he went out shooting, that he was sort of shooting the gamekeepers and the entourage. You know, not stand anywhere. It was safer to stand behind him, right behind him, rather than anywhere where he could shoot you in the leg or in the foot, or just find something whistling over your head. He wasn't very coordinated, let's say. But of course, nothing was known in those days of any of the things we know about, like dyspraxia and dyslexia and what all the different ways there are of slower learning. So the poor child was just criticised. In adulthood, the Queen kept up her disapproval of her son because he'd married Princess Alexandra, and she liked a good time. Not anything disgraceful, but she didn't have any control over her husband, which the Queen rather naively was expecting that she would be a good influence on her wayward son. She would keep him in check. Well, Princess Alexandra did nothing of the kind. She hadn't got that kind of personality. She was very accepting of her husband's wayward behaviour. And they were called the Marlborough set, the people who, because that was their London house, Marlborough House. Late nights, lots of not drinking, not falling over sort of drunk, but lots of drinking fine wine, eating fine food. Lots of gambling, of course, the Queen disapproved of, and a kind of very late nights, a very racy lifestyle. Of course, the Queen totally disapproved of this. Consequently, she totally disapproved of his two sons. They had a much larger family than that, had girls as well, but the two boys, Queen Victoria couldn't stand them. She said they were as wild as hawks, meaning they were out of control. It's not likely that they were, but Queen Victoria didn't like small children anyway, so unless they behaved themselves impeccably, and that usually meant not saying anything, and certainly not racing around making a noise, which these two boys did. They were just ordinary boys, being boyish, but the Queen couldn't bear it. She couldn't bear noise, particularly after Prince Albert died. She was sort of phobic about noise or anything that disturbed her routine. She then, again, illogically, she wasn't going out. She wasn't doing her, she'd gone into seclusion. These were the years of seclusion where she wasn't appearing in public. But she then got very jealous of her son and daughter-in-law because they were filling the gap that she had created. You know, launching ships and opening bridges and hospitals and so forth. And she got very jealous. and really quite peevish about it, that they were seen in public. She thought that they were showing off, and it was awful. So again, childish and illogical. Again, illogically, she wouldn't let her son, Bertie, the future Edward VII, see any state papers. She instructed all her ministers, the prime ministers in particular, they were not to let him see anything of any importance, because she said she didn't trust him. He got these racy, rackety friends, and they drank and they talked indiscreetly, and she just daren't trust him with any state papers whatsoever. Again, treating him like a child. But then criticised him for his lifestyle. She wouldn't let him do anything particularly serious, but then criticised him because he seemed to have this, what she thought it was an awful lifestyle. Well, what was he supposed to do? Got all his time on his hands. He wasn't allowed to do anything serious. He wanted to. And various prime ministers who liked Bertie, liked him very much, begged her to change her attitude, but no, absolutely no way. She wasn't a woman who ever changed her mind. No, she would not let him see state papers. So we move on to Alice. Alice was the one who had looked after her father in his final illness. Alice had a gift for looking after people. Nowadays, she would have wanted to be a nurse. She married young, again, a love match, Prince Louis of Hesse-Darmstadt, and went to live in Germany, in Darmstadt, which is the capital of this little German kingdom. The Queen complained constantly that Alice had sort of abandoned her, and she needed a daughter at home, and Alice would have been ideal, and why didn't they come and live in England? She didn't seem to understand that Alice wanted to live with her husband and that he had duties in Germany. So she then sort of turned against Alice and criticised her again when Alice came over to this country to see her mother. The Queen complained that Alice looked very thin and why wasn't she eating properly, and particularly annoyed that Alice chose to feed her own children. Queen Victoria had an absolute phobia about breastfeeding. She thought it was disgusting. And again, we know this because this is what she wrote to her daughter, dearest child, in Berlin. She told Vicky what she thought about childbirth, it was horrible, and what she thought about breastfeeding, disgusting. And went into detail. And it was just a sort of throwaway comment. She explained very carefully why she found it so dreadful, animal-like, awful, and how disgusted she was with Alice for breastfeeding her own children instead of having a wet nurse, like respectable people did, like the Queen herself had done. She certainly hadn't fed her own children. And they actually, they got the home farm at Windsor, and they've got a dairy, so they've got a herd of cows. And when one of them gave birth to a calf, just after Alice had announced that she was going to feed her own children, they called the baby Alice.
The baby cow.
The baby cow, yeah, the calf called it Alice. She wore herself out. Alice was a very good woman, and she wore herself out doing good works in Hesse-Darmstadt. She's remembered very fondly by the people there, even today. Hospitals, clinics, what we now call social work. She set up all sorts of charities and establishments that are called after her. So a very good person. She died very prematurely, only 35 years old, died of diphtheria caught off her own children. So an absolute tragedy. An absolute tragedy. Of course, when she died, the Queen, she was my favourite child, and what a disaster, the Queen was could turn quite quickly from criticism to lavish praise and paying tribute. If only she'd done that during Alice's time in Germany, if only she'd appreciated her more. Then Alfred, Affy. Affy was favourite for a time because he looked like his father. That was always a good point in Queen Victoria's opinion. If they looked like Prince Albert, they were halfway there to becoming favourite child. He was lively. Affy was lively as a child, but not cheeky. He got the balance just right. So his mother thought that he was a lovely, chatty, intelligent child. Well, she was wrong about the intelligence. Later, she changed her mind and said he was reserved, touchy, vague, and willful. Collection of criticisms. It was decided that he would go into the Navy. That was his future. And when he came home on leave, when he was a midshipman, the Queen was, again, full of praise for him because he told her where he'd been and people he'd met. He was a conversationalist. The Queen was very shy. We need to remember this, very shy. She found conversation, even with her own children, really quite difficult. We would say today she had no small talk. Well, the small talk was so small, it was banal. She didn't really know how to conduct conversation. So she loved people who chatted away and she didn't have to really make any effort or say anything very much. So Affy was great. He came home on leave and was talking very excitedly about all the things he'd seen. Comparing him, of course, with Bertie, big brother, who was so different, who didn't seem to have small talk. And of course, I mean, poor Bertie knew he was being criticised even before the Queen opened her mouth and she would have a go at him. So he was a bit tongue-tied. Any child would be, knowing that that particular parent was so disapproving. He was inhibited. Affy knew he was liked, so chatted away. And then if she liked somebody, she ignored their faults, and if she didn't like them, she ignored their virtues. So she ignored the fact that her son actually had a really quick temper like she had, that he was arrogant, that he was greedy for money. And then she discovered, and the sort of scales fell from her eyes, that he had an illicit love affair while he was stationed in Malta. And all of a sudden, she decided that her son was going all bad ways, but she looked down to somebody to blame. It was Bertie's fault. Bertie and Affy had been together on various occasions, and Bertie had corrupted his brother. So it wasn't entirely Alfred's fault. But she did realise after a time that her son was actually quite an unpleasant character. She began to confide in her daughter, in Vicky, and say what a disappointment Affy was. He then compounded the error by insisting on marrying a Russian princess against the Queen's wishes. She didn't like anything. I mean, this is very current, of course. She hated Russians. She hated anything to do with Russia, and she was absolutely appalled to discover that her son, Affy, was hoping to marry into the Russian royal family against her wishes. So again, scales fell from her eyes when she realised she had no control over this grown-up son. He wasn't the biddable child he had been when he was little. And so he married. It was a very unhappy marriage. He turned to drink. He drank very heavily, became an alcoholic, and became a bit of a nightmare. Nobody wanted to sit near him at banquets and feasts because he was so boring. He talked about himself all the time, bragged and boasted about his achievements, and eventually died of alcohol. I mean, he died of cancer, but he very weakened, very, very dramatically weakened by his alcohol poisoning, and estranged from his wife, as the Queen had predicted. She turned out to be right in the end. It was not a happy union. So Prince Alfred, Martin found some lovely pictures of the children, all looking absolutely angelic. And those of you who are thinking, has Martin made a mistake? Prince Alfred looks as though he's dressed as a girl. No, Martin hasn't made a mistake. Prince Alfred is dressed like a girl. They all, the boys, were dressed like girls until they were 4 or 5. It was a very old tradition. It probably went back to a sort of pre-Christian idea that if you dressed the boys like girls, bad, demons wouldn't come and collect them and take them away. It's a very ancient sort of primitive superstition that demons only get boys. So if you dress them as girls, the demons will be very, very confused and will leave them alone. The other more practical and more sensible theory is that it was easier to change their nappies if they got skirts rather than breeches. That makes more sense. It's probably a mixture of the two. But anyway, if you're sort of thinking, why they all wearing lovely little sticky out dresses, that's why. They are boys, but they are wearing girls' clothes. Well, they weren't girls' clothes, they were their clothes. They were for boys. But that's the reason. So the next one was Princess Helena, and the Queen right from the poor child's infancy was she called her Lenchen, which is German nickname for Helena, the end of the name. They nearly always gave their children nicknames. Right from being a toddler, the Queen was sort of, oh, poor Lenchen, she's so plain. And as she grew up, oh dear, she's so clumsy, and she puts weight on so easily, and her deportment's so awful. What are we going to do with her? It was a sort of almost sort of sticking this label on the poor child that she's going to be a failure because she's not pretty. However, so the quote, which I've put in the notes, poor dear Lenchen, although most useful and active and clever and amiable, so throwing in all the compliments, does not improve in looks and has great difficulty with her figure and her want of quiet, graceful manners. Poor girl. But the Queen, when she lost her husband, made it very clear that one of her daughters was going to be selected to be her life companion. She could not manage on her own. One of her daughters would have to surrender all hope of getting married and become her companion. And so for a time, that was Lenchen's fate or destiny, that she was with her mother. She acted as a secretary when necessary, and a sort of body servant, you might say. But because she wasn't brilliantly good at it, because she was rather clumsy and a bit forgetful, the Queen then decided that Lenchen should get married on condition that she married somebody that was willing to stay in this country, so Lenchen could continue to be the Queen's support, but would actually have a husband that could help as well. That was the plan. The problem then was, who was she going to find that would cope with what she saw as Lenchen's many shortcomings? And she found somebody. Surprisingly, she found somebody with her daughter's help. With Vicky's help. She found a prince, and he got a huge long title, but no land. No land at all. Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, Sonderburg, Augustenburg. Won't go into detail about how he lost the family estates through war and being on the wrong side. The estates had disappeared. Ideal. He was sort of royalty, but without any pretensions, and would be willing to come and live in this country. Great. So it turned into a very happy, companionable marriage. When he came to this country to be given the once-over by Queen Victoria, various people got it into he got it into his head, and so did some of the people, his entourage, got it into their heads that he was being checked over to be the Queen's second husband. Because although he was only 35, he looked a lot older. He'd gone bald very, very young. He was slightly overweight, had he got a glass eye, which he used to take out and show to people. He got a whole array of glass eyes, for different occasions. He's very proud of the bloodshot one. That if he'd been drinking, he'd got this special eye which would match the other eye, and he got this little cabinet, and he would sort of take the eyes out and show people, and not registering. A lot of people found it absolutely awful to be expected to be interested in these eyes, and found them really kind of off-putting. But anyway, that's the sort of person he was, rather insensitive, but it turned into a very happy marriage. And he stayed sort of in this country and with the Queen as long as he could stand it. And then even he, although he's a lovely patient man, gentle sort of character, decided he'd had enough of the Queen bossing his wife around and bossing him around. And they moved away, although they stayed in this country, but they moved away from Lake and Helena having this job of looking after a mother all the time. She represented her mother on many occasions and became very popular. The public liked Helena because she was friendly and chatty and everything that her mother wasn't during her years of staying indoors, her years of seclusion. And she wasn't plain. I mean, the Queen had just got this idea that her daughter was plain, and in the portraits and the photographs, the camera does not lie, she's perfectly acceptable. So we don't know quite why the Queen had got this attitude. Princess Louise, different kettle of fish, very pretty, acknowledged. I mean, the Queen actually told her daughter once, daughter in Berlin, Vicky, Vicky had said, "I know you don't like, Mother, I know you don't like children." And Queen Victoria immediately replied, "I do like children. I like the pretty ones." more or less confirms what Vicky was saying. You don't really like children very much. You're sort of thinking of them as ornaments. So Louise was different from the start. Wayward, independent, very confident, very artistic, and answered back. The other children did not answer back. Louise did. She fell out with her family members. Oh, interesting. Shall I carry on? She was definitely the prettiest of all the daughters, but with what the Queen thought of as a rather unfortunate personality. What she meant was that she argued with her mother. She supported Bertie. They were sort of best friends when they were all living at home. And she actually believed that the Queen should abdicate. She thought after the Queen lost her husband that she really shouldn't be Queen anymore. She was taking it so badly and refusing to appear in public that she really didn't deserve to be Queen anymore, and she should abdicate in favour of Bertie. Well, that was a very extreme view. And the Queen found out, and obviously was not very thrilled to bits about that. Princess Louise was very, very talented. She was a sculptress, and she begged and begged the Queen, her mother, to give her permission to be properly trained. And finally, the Queen, very exasperated by all this pestering and nagging, gave way, and Louise was properly trained at Art College. She's the only one who married a commoner. I think we've mentioned that before. It turned out to be not exactly unhappy. It started off all right, but the belief is that her husband was actually gay. No children. The only one of Queen Victoria's 9 children not to have any children of her own. The Queen was a bit afraid of Louise. She didn't understand her artistic temperament at all. And Louise, although she was invited to all the family get-togethers, which the Queen was so fond of, certainly later life, Louise was always a troublemaker. She carried comments from one member of the family to another. She told tales. She wasn't trustworthy. She was a gossip and a troublemaker, unfortunately. Prince Arthur, completely different. The Queen doted on Arthur from the word go, as soon as he was born. she probably had an easier labour, an easier birth with Prince Arthur. And she once told Prince Albert, and this is in your notes, she had adored little Arthur from the day of his birth. He is dearer than any of the others put together. Thus, after you, she's speaking to her husband, he is the dearest and most precious object to me on earth. This is how the Queen talked, in a very, we would say, a very over-the-top, emotional way of writing, which is certainly not fashionable today. And but that is how the Queen wrote. Certainly she wrote like this all the time. Arthur accepted all the controls, all the limitations on his life as an army cadet. He wanted to go in the army, and that was his destiny, that was his future. Mustn't mix with Eton boys of his age because they were corrupt and evil and gambled and swore, and they were bad boys. So her son must not mix with them. He was pure. She kept on using this word pure. She'd used the same word about her husband, pure. So Arthur's wonderful purity must not be damaged in any way or infringed. His billet must be kept at a temperature of 56 degrees with open windows. Well, at the moment, you know, people are accepting open windows, but in winter, no. The Queen got an absolute obsession with fresh air and open windows and low temperatures, because she didn't feel the cold, and she felt very oppressed in the summer. She used the word stifled. She felt stifled, and there was something wrong with her temperature control. The first thing she'd done when her son was at death's door in 1871, he was at death's door in Sandringham. Bertie was. The doctors had virtually despaired of him. He got typhoid so badly. The Queen visited Sandringham for the first time. She had boycotted Sandringham because she disapproved of her, as we said, disapproved of her son and daughter-in-law's behaviour when they lived in London. So she assumed that they were doing the same thing when they lived in Norfolk, which wasn't quite the case. But she decided that she was going to go and see her son before it was too late, visit his deathbed, she thought. And the first thing she did when she arrived was give her servants that she'd take with her, she ordered them to open all the windows. It was December. Open all the windows and put the fires out in somebody else's house. So that's how autocratic and demanding she could be, and how unsympathetic and well, we would say was kind of ridiculous, like a child wanting its own way all the time. Arthur accepted these limitations. He was a very gracious, calm sort of young man, and he never rebelled, never answered her back, never complained. He married a Prussian princess, also called Louise, and was happy in the army, happy in his marriage, which he deserved to be after all this control. Became the Duke of Connaught, that was his title. And there are lots of places in London and other places called Connaught Place, Connaught Road, etc. Because like various other members of the family, he did work for the Queen when she was in, not retirement, but in seclusion. He took over the royal role. And then Prince Leopold, poor Prince Leopold, they didn't know what was wrong with him. He was an ugly baby. Well, she again condemned him as an ugly baby. He didn't look like his father, so he didn't have a very good start, even before they'd identified and diagnosed the fact that he was haemophiliac. And even then, the Queen almost blamed him for spoiling what she thought was an idyllic married life with these children, these lovely children. He got this awful disease, and she was very angry about it. She didn't quite know who to be angry with, whether to be angry with God or angry. She just didn't know who to blame, and always ended up blaming the child for spoiling this idyll. So it was a bit like Helena, it was like Lenchen. She blamed Leopold when he grew up for the way he stood, the way he looked. His nose was too big. He didn't stand properly. he retaliated. He didn't stand for it. He argued with her. Amazingly, had the courage to argue. Very, very intelligent, like his father. Would have benefited from a university education, but she wouldn't hear of it. She finally did agree that he would go to Oxford University, but he would live separately from the other students, and he would have a governor, and the governor would report to her every day with every single thing that Leopold had done. Prince Leopold must have this and that, and the other kind of food, and she expected a report of what he'd had for breakfast, what he'd had for lunch, what he'd had for evening meal, what he'd had for supper, how much he'd drunk, where he'd been, what time he came back, what time he went to bed. He got to be in bed for 9 o'clock. He resented this and wasn't in bed for 9 o'clock. The governor had to write, Prince Leopold did not go to bed until 11 o'clock. Shock horror. This is an adult son in his 20s. The Queen didn't think anybody would, she'd never find anybody to marry him because he was so damaged by his condition. To her astonishment, she found there was actually a bit of a queue. And Prince, they had he had a happy marriage, only brief, but a happy marriage to Princess Helen of Waldeck-Pyrmont. And they managed to have 2 children, one born during his lifetime and the other one born after Prince Leopold died. Very sadly, he did die young. He died in his 30s, but it was astonishing that he had lived as long as he had. And then finally, a gap of 4 years, and then Princess Beatrice. Very pretty. The flower of the flock, she was called. So, of course, the Queen liked her because she was pretty. And everybody admired Beatrice. They said what a little angel she was. Masses of golden wavy hair, great big blue eyes. They'd all got blue eyes, but she got particularly big and very blue eyes, and a beautiful complexion, which again, they all had this lovely complexion, but you know, she got this lovely colouring, and so everybody just fell in love with this little girl. The Queen's attitude to her was that she was an absolute little sweetheart, and so she favoured her, possibly because she had gained a great deal of experience by this time. Princess Beatrice was going to be her last child. So she was spoiled in the sense that people, you know, she wasn't treated harshly like some of the others, and certainly not criticised like some of the others. So she had a lot more freedom and said all sorts of cute things. She was allowed to stay up at a banquet. She was allowed to sit and sit in, really. She wasn't expected to eat any of the special food, but she was asking if she could have some, and the Queen said no, it's not suitable for you, not suitable for you. And Princess Beatrice said, but I like it, my dear. Called him my dear, and reached out and got whatever this was and put it on her plate. And the Queen didn't react harshly as she would have done with most of her other children. They're much more lenient and much more accepting of Princess Beatrice because she was so cute, and all the palace servants thought she was very cute as well. But she did say, the Queen did say, this is the daughter that is going to be my companion. She's absolutely ideal. She's attractive, and she's well-meaning and kind and lovely, and she's the one. So nobody was mentioned facts of life to her or talk about marriage. Nobody must talk about marriage. This is a commandment. The Queen had spoken. Nobody must mention marriage to Princess Beatrice, and put ideas into her head. And she must not meet any young men. So but unfortunately, it didn't work. With one of the great family get-togethers, which the Queen was so keen on, her children, her grown-up children, their children, and in later life, of course, she was having great-grandchildren because she'd married young and they married young, and so it was the next generation and the generation after that. She had these huge get-togethers, family get-togethers, and photographs and so on. Princess Beatrice managed to sort of escape from this net, of this controlling net, and met a cousin, a Battenberg cousin, a German cousin, of course, Henry of Battenberg. and they fell in love and announced that, well, she announced that she wanted to get married. Queen reacted, as you'd imagine, absolutely furious, and didn't speak to her daughter for 6 months, despite the fact that they spent every day together. They went out riding together, riding in the pony carriage together. Beatrice was like the Queen's special secretary, would say today, her PA, but she didn't speak to her. They communicated by notes. A servant was asked, give this to the Princess Beatrice. And then Princess Beatrice wrote a note back, and the servant took it to the Queen. 6 months of this ridiculous charade, this nonsense. And then the Queen gave in. She was under pressure. The Prime Minister at the time was begging her to be more sensible, not sensible, more reasonable. And she was her favourite daughter. So she finally gave in, and then very dramatically gave in. Couldn't do enough for Beatrice. Let her wear her own precious wedding veil, which was it had become a sort of an icon. It had become almost like a sacred relic to the Queen. But she let Beatrice wear this veil at her wedding. It was amazing. People were absolutely astounded. And it turned out to be a lovely wedding at Whipping and the Isle of Wight. A lovely wedding, a sort of country wedding, although obviously royalty turned up, but it was compared with most weddings in London, a sort of either St Paul's or Westminster Abbey. It was a very nice, simple wedding, which is what Beatrice wanted. Very sadly, well, it was a very happy marriage, and they managed to have 4 children, although the Queen was convinced that Beatrice had left it too late, so that she had a baby every year, much to the Queen's disgust. That was awful. Talked about, it's like the rabbits in Windsor Great Park. Yeah, she'd had 9 children, but when other people had children, you know, she immediately criticised them. So yeah, totally illogical, absolutely illogical. So 4 children, virtually in a very short time, and then very sadly, her husband died. Not in action, died of disease. And poor Princess Beatrice ended up, like her life had gone in a circle, she ended up being her mother's constant companion for the rest of her life and secretary to her mother. So again, back to being a PA. Grew very shy, serious, not the little bouncy little girl she'd been. Of course, she suffered terribly from early onset rheumatism, and she was the one that protected the Queen's reputation. And the historian's nightmare that when her mother died, she destroyed any documents that she thought would impinge on her mother's wonderful reputation. So references to John Brown, references to the Munchie, the extravagant way the Queen spoke about people that she loved. Beatrice destroyed letters, destroyed documents, and so historians are not very keen on Princess Beatrice. She lived until 1945. She did a lot of good work, a good woman. Her life really blighted by this having to constantly be with her mother, who wouldn't allow any change of any kind. So poor Princess Beatrice became very old-fashioned and rather well, old before her time, you could say. Not her fault, just being with her mother all the time. So
where did she live? She lived in Buckingham Palace?
Yes, she lived with her mother. Yes, sadly. Yeah, Marty just said, where did she live? Yeah, she had apartments in wherever the Queen went, she went. Then famously, the Queen came out of this long seclusion, and we've got the Jubilees. The Golden Jubilee, 1887, was a great occasion, but the Diamond Jubilee was, as you'd expect, an even greater occasion, because this was the first time that a monarch had lived that long or been a monarch for such a long time. Her Prime Minister was Lord Salisbury. They got on extremely well. That certainly wasn't always the case. She didn't get on all that well with all her Prime Ministers. She absolutely loathed Gladstone, was totally open about it. She thought he was mad. half mad firebrand, but to her daughter, she said he was completely mad. She absolutely hated Gladstone. Felt quite the opposite about Lord Salisbury, that he was a safe pair of hands. She felt content that her country was being well looked after by Lord Salisbury, and they got on as two individuals. Every day I feel the blessing of a strong government in such safe and strong hands as yours. She didn't make as many conditions and provisos as she normally did on any occasion, even going out for a picnic. You know, she had everything changed, all the plans, and decided what would be on the menu. So people were sort of dreading the diamond, thinking she was going to interfere all the time, but she didn't. She was old by this time, and she didn't make as many complaints as she normally did. She did refuse to wear a crown, though. A lot of pressure put on her to wear a little dainty crown that had been made specially for her, but she said no, she wouldn't. She chose a bonnet trimmed with white feathers, so that was her compromise. And she did agree to put something on her black dress to make it a light little bit, so that was grey. So grey satin, but at least it wasn't dead black. She couldn't walk really very well at all by this time. She put on a lot of weight through poor mobility. And the fact she liked her food, she liked sweet things. She always had second helpings of the dessert, so she was a bit, to put it mildly, a bit round. She was clinically obese by this time. And she couldn't really go up steps. Well, she could, but only by leaning heavily on somebody, and she didn't think that would look very queen-like. So it was decided that she would arrive in an open landau, an open carriage, and that it would stay at the bottom of the steps to St. Paul. She couldn't manage the steps. And Martin's found this brilliant picture of the arrangement of the troops and the choirs and so forth outside. Luckily, it was a good day, nice day. And the troops were representing the huge empire. So it was the Diamond Jubilee was an absolute celebration of the empire on which the sun never set. This wonderful phrase that somewhere in the world, people were waking up when we were going to sleep, we were going to bed, because our kingdom, our empire by that time was so extensive, a quarter of the world's surface. Pretty amazing. And it was a celebration, a triumph, like a Roman triumph. Very heavy emphasis on the troops, the soldiers from all these different colonies and dominions, all sent troops in their particular uniforms. So very exotic, many of them. Some of the African ones getting so around in tribal gear. So, you know, for the spectators, it was an absolute joy, absolutely wonderful to watch all these men, all these soldiers parading. Absolutely amazing spectacle. It was a very, very successful occasion. It brought great pride, enormous pride, to particularly the working classes in London. They felt, although they were poor and sort of downtrodden and lived in slums and had awful jobs, and they were able to associate themselves with the empire and feel incredibly proud of being British. Other countries, of course, said, well, this is arrogance. This is the British being arrogant. But it wasn't just arrogance. It was a sort of simple joy in the fact that a small country on the edge of Europe had managed to acquire all these colonies, all these territories, particularly India. The jewel in the crown, as it was called, the best bit. And the Queen, of course, felt exactly the same. She was very proud of being Empress, Queen and Empress. And this is the period when so many statues were made of the Queen and so many places called after the Queen. and all these places are abroad called Victoria. The Boer War at the end of her reign was the opposite of the two Jubilees. A bit of a wake-up call that we'd become involved in a colonial war against the Boers, who were originally Dutch. Afrikaans is a form of Dutch language. As usual, when we got involved in a war, it was all going to be over in a few weeks. We'd said the same thing, exactly the same thing about the Crimean War. We said it about the First World War when that broke out. It was going to be over really quickly because our army was so fantastic. We never really got over the Battle of Waterloo. We never really got over the pride we'd felt in defeating Napoleon. So we always underestimated our enemy and overestimated our army. And the Boer War was a bit of a wake-up call in all sorts of ways. It revealed the fact that our army, through no fault of their own, wasn't that brilliant, that our commanders weren't that brilliant, that people who are fighting, well, as we're finding now because of the Ukraine, people who are fighting in their own homeland, fight in a different way from just on a field of battle like Waterloo, because they are defending their home territory, which is what the Boers were doing. The Boers were defending their homeland. And it was a different kind of war anyway. Lots of snipers. No pitched battle. Well, there were some pitched battles, but it wasn't that kind of a war. There were lots of ambushes. We would say, well, that's awful. That's fighting dirty. That's it's like hitting below the belt. It's not cricket. That's an awful way to fight. You know, we want sort of proper battles, and you give people warning that you're going to start the battle, and you know, do it properly.
Are we
Then,
ready?
yes, see which side wins. You've got to fight fair. But the Boers didn't see it that way at all. The ordinary Boer farmers were sharpshooters. They shot things that were after their livestock. So we've got people who were not trained, well, not trained, specifically trained for the army, that were very, very good at killing British soldiers. So it wasn't a regular war, and our commanders were a little rather baffled by this. And so it took rather a long time for it to sink in that we weren't actually winning, which is why it went on for such a long time. Some historians have said this was a complete wake-up call and the end of our enormous pride in the empire. That is debatable, but there were certainly in high places, and certainly the high command in the army, reflecting on how badly the war was going and thinking that we needed to change our ways or not be quite so arrogant and so pleased with ourselves, not quite so complacent. That's, in that respect, it was a wake-up call, not to be so complacent and not to live in the past. You know, everything in the past was wonderful, and so we were living on past glory. The arrogant attitude is exemplified in a lot of poetry written at the time. I've just been reading some, I've forgotten, I got them some poetry books. I was trying to get rid of some books recently for a sale of work that we were having at King's Standing Methodist Church. And I'd forgotten I'd got these poetry books, and I looked at them, and there was a whole section on sort of the empire. Quite a lot of poems by Kipling, when he talked about lesser breeds. You know, very racist now. They sort of make you absolutely wince. But they weren't considered racist then. You know, we were the best nation in the world. God had favoured us. How come we got such a wonderful empire if we weren't top nation? God's favourite. We were like the new Israelites. And it was like we'd got God totally on our side. What could go wrong? Well, the Boer War went rather wrong. in that way, it was definitely a wake-up call. Queen Victoria had no doubt. She was very valiant, really, during the war. A good example of it will all come right in the end. She was totally non-racist. We've said it before, but it needs saying again. She loved what she called her dusky subjects. Again, it makes you wince. That sounds awful, dusky subjects, but compared with what most people were thinking at the time, she was amazing. Way ahead of her time, way ahead. She absolutely loved hearing about people and meeting people in later life when she came out of her seclusion. And of course, she loved the Munchie. He was dark-skinned. A lot of people disliked him simply for that reason, and she was quick to sense that and to understand that the fact that the people in the palace didn't like the Munchie was because he was dark-skinned, and she railed against them, and she was right. There was a great, absolute racism at the time, and she was definitely not racist. Her health slowly declined. She was she seemed well, really, until the turn of the century, and then we know from her diary that her journal, that she began to record how ill she felt, and she also suffered many family bereavements in a fairly short period of time. And members of her household, servants who had stayed loyal to her, or are actually the same age as the Queen, sort of in their early 80s. And that added to her unhappiness and discomfort because she hated change. So she was grief-stricken because she'd lost them anyway, but also that it was disturbing to her way of life. She disliked change. She was phobic about change because it disturbed her so much. Her eyesight became a serious problem. She wouldn't have a cataract operation. Can't really blame her for that. So her doctors gave her belladonna in the hope that would help her eyesight, and it did for a while, and then it didn't. And it became a real problem. She kept asking her secretary, Sir Henry Ponsonby, to write. She claimed that he was writing in the wrong with the wrong kind of ink, which he wasn't. It was her eyes that were deteriorating, but she wouldn't have it. It was her eyes. It was him. He wasn't using the right kind of ink. So she insisted that he used better quality ink, and he tried everything. He was scrupulous in trying to find something so black on much whiter paper. He ordered different sort of paper, so it was very white, so very black writing on very white paper, hoping that would help. But she went on complaining that she couldn't read what he'd written, and that was when Princess Beatrice came in. She read everything to her mother in her last few years because the Queen couldn't read, and it caused confusion and mistakes because Princess Beatrice didn't always understand the context, or she didn't understand some of the words used, and she read them wrong. And poor Sir Henry Ponsonby was in despair at the situation because of the situation. By 1900, the Queen was losing weight, in a lot of pain from rheumatism, sleeping very badly, being very demanding. Her poor ladies in waiting were woken up to 5 times a night because the Queen couldn't sleep. So she rang her bell, and they were in attendance, so they had to attend. And she would ask for something, and they would get it for her, and then they would settle down and just fall asleep, and then she'd ring the bell again because she wasn't asleep. So that was the selfish side of the Queen, that she was a bad patient, in that she was demanding help which really couldn't be given. She'd got the strongest sleeping drafts possible. There was nothing else that the doctors could do. She gradually declined, but nothing dramatic. It wasn't cancer or anything like that. It was old age, and they would say today she died of heart failure. Her family, there were enough signs for the family to gather, including Vicky's eldest son, the heir, the future Kaiser, Wilhelm, who had a love-hate relationship with his grandmother. Claimed he loved her to bits, but on the other hand, every so often he was denouncing, he hated Britain, he hated England, hated his mother. Once he had a nosebleed and said it was good he was having such a bad nosebleed, he was bleeding out all his English blood because he hated England. So it's, well, Britain or England, he called it England, he meant Britain so much. A very disturbed character, psychologically very disturbed, not just because he got a paralysed arm and problems with his neck, because he had such a terrible birth trauma, being sort of dragged and pulled, and therefore it damaged. He was a damaged baby as soon as he was born. Psychologically, a mess. He insisted on coming to this country, although he'd behaved very badly on previous visits, and the Queen didn't want him, but he turned up anyway, and insisted on marching into the bedroom where she was lying, dying, although still conscious. The adult children tried to get rid of him, and he wouldn't be got rid of. So that turned into embarrassment, and she actually died. You probably know this because it's quite well known that he had put his arm around his grandmother to hold her up because her breathing had deteriorated, and it said she died in his arms. Now that wasn't quite true. He was actually just propping her up. He hadn't got both arms around her. It sounds as you say he died in her arms. It sounds as though he got both arms around her. But the family were really angry about the way he'd taken over, as though he thought they were all inferior. He actually did think they were, and that he was her equal, because he was the heir to the Prussian throne, and the heir to not just the Prussian throne, but the German throne. It was now an empire. From 1871, the German, all the little states in Germany had united under one crown, the Prussian crown, and Germany was now a Reich. It was a kingdom, and so he was the emperor, or the future emperor, and he insisted on this being accepted. So then I've done a sort of summary, really, of negative and assessment, summary, negative and positive indications. First of all, we know she was stubborn and self-willed, it goes without saying. But she did accept the opinions of others if given convincing arguments. She wasn't totally, always, absolutely stubborn. Very controlling parent. Her adult children were in fear of her. And I've said, as a sort of explanation, she herself hadn't had a normal family life. So she didn't really understand what children were like. How they were supposed to behave. She was actually a good mother because she cared too much. You could put a positive spin on it and say the fact she was writing to them in later life, advising them and telling them what to do, showed how much she cared. She was certainly, we need to give her credit, she was great with her grandchildren. She was really nice to her grandchildren. The future Duke of Windsor loved his grandma, really loved her grandmama. She loved him. She thought he was a dear little boy, and he enjoyed his visits to her, but in awe of her. That she wasn't a kind of an ordinary grandma. He knew that she was a queen and an empress, and so he was in awe of her. But he trotted in and sort of shared his, took toys with. She liked children that were outgoing, like Beatrice had been when she was little, because she lacked small talk. She didn't know what to say to them. So she liked the ones that sort of chatted away, and she didn't have to make much of an effort. She was very selfish, as we've proved, showed little concern for others. But on the other hand, her ladies in waiting and her ministers said that she could be very kind, very thoughtful, very generous. She gave very expensive presents to people. Basically, she was very, very shy and very unsure of herself. That's why she leaded the prince consort so much, why she was so shattered when he died. It wasn't just, you know, she lost him as a husband. He was her support, and she needed support. She really was a very shy, you could say kind of awkward person. She didn't understand the concept of impartiality. She didn't understand the role of constitutional monarchs, which is very interesting. She just didn't seem to sort of grasp what happened when there was an election, that you had to accept what happened in after an election. She actually said, oops, no, she didn't say oops. That was my paper falling onto my lap. She talked about, didn't quite understand why, oh, here we are. The elections are beyond man's understanding, a visitor remarked to Mrs. Gladstone. The course of events can only be guided by the one above. Oh, yes, Mrs. Gladstone replied, and if you wait, you'll be down to tea in 5 minutes. That was her husband. Yet even now, the Queen had not seen the last of the abominable old man, that's Gladstone, who returned to power after a Liberal victory in the election of 1892, a victory won by a narrow margin, which prompted the Queen to comment that these are trying moments, and it seems to me a defect in our much famed constitution to have to part with an admirable government like Lord Salisbury's for no question of any importance or any particular reason, merely on account of the number of votes. So she didn't really understand democracy at all. Sort of contemptuously said, just on account of the number of votes. Well, that's what it's all about. People expressing a preference. And on many other occasions, she'd shown that she wasn't constitutional at all. She actually had favourite people and people she couldn't stand the sight of, and that she openly talked about. You know, she loved Disraeli, she hated Gladstone, she loved Salisbury, etc. A strange person, really, but we do know that she was very, very much loved, but strange, has to be said, eccentric. So just read this, share this with you. Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, he later became a Liberal Prime Minister in the 1906 government. Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, who was there one winter as minister in attendance when this is Balmoral, when the snow was thick on the ground, reported to his wife, "It is the funniest life conceivable, like a convent. We meet at meals, breakfast 9:45, lunch 2 o'clock, dinner at 9, and when we've finished with it, off to his cell. In this weather, I spend the whole day reading alone in my room. The castle is carpeted and curtained in tartan. It is all intersected by long, narrow passages ending in baize doors, and I could not find my way. It has been a perfectly dreadful day, snowing ever since 10 a.m. I drove to church, etc. My companions envied me my nice fur coat. I bet they did. The amusing thing is the way the household lament the dullness. Certainly the actual dinner is sad enough. Everyone half whispering to their neighbour. They are all so sick of each other, they jump at a stranger. They are sick of each other. Very telling. I will just end by saying that the Queen has this reputation, we are not amused. There is some doubt as to whether she ever said that. Certainly in her early years, when she wrote so much in her journal, she often said, we were very amused, very amused. And she definitely had a sense of humour, but it wasn't the kind of sense of humour that most people would say counted. As Disraeli once said, I'm paraphrasing, he was a very witty man, of course, very witty, and people fell about laughing at a lot of things he said. But he said rather bitterly on one occasion, there's no point polishing a comment or working out a witty phrase when trapping one's finger in the door serves so much better. In other words, that was when the Prince was still alive. Certainly what the Prince had very, very little sense of humour, but what they liked was a kind of clown, almost like a circus. It was they liked slapstick. They liked it. Well, chopping your finger in the door. They liked people to look disconcerted. People falling off chairs, hilarious. As long as they hadn't hurt themselves too badly, it was hilarious. Anything. I mean, I will just end by this with this anecdote. And the Queen was old by this time. It was certainly in her final years. Upon a later hilarious occasion, this time at luncheon, an old, deaf, garrulous admiral was telling the Queen at inordinate length how a ship which had sunk off the south coast had been raised and towed into Portsmouth. Anxious to stop the admiral's flow of boring detail about the salvage operation, the Queen tried to change the subject by asking him about his sister. Mishearing her, the ancient mariner replied, "Well, ma'am, I'm going to have her turned over, take a good look at her bottom, and have it scraped." As the footmen in attendance withdrew behind the screen, the Queen put down her knife and fork, hid her face in her handkerchief, and shook and heaved with laughter until the tears rolled down her face. She did have a sense of humour, a sense of fun, and in later years, she did laugh and smile a lot. It says one evening in April 1888, she laughed incessantly and was full of all the interesting people she'd seen in Berlin. She gave her opinions in a most decided and amusing manner. Being together, very amusing, and her ladies-in-waiting confirmed this. So there was a lovely side to Queen Victoria, which is why people remained so loyal to her for so long. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Judy. A nice bombshell on which to end. Thank you for your support. We'll gather again, God willing, in a fortnight. Thank you very much indeed. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, stay well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.